I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to cheat on her husband. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have laughed at the idea. Peter and I had been married for nearly 8 years, and while our relationship wasn't perfect, I believed in us. We had a life together, 2 kids, a nice home, and the usual chaos that comes with balancing work, marriage, and parenthood. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Or maybe it was me who changed. It wasn't that I stopped loving Peter. I still cared about him deeply, but the connection we once had was fading. Our conversations had become practical, about bills, schedules, and the kids, never about us. We were more like co-managers of a household than lovers. The affection was still there, but the passion was gone. We hadn't truly connected in months. That's where Alex came in. He and his wife, Linda, had moved in next door about a year ago. They were around the same age as Peter and me, both in their mid-30s. Linda was sweet, always stopping by with cookies or some new recipe she tried. But it was Alex who caught my attention. From the start, there was something about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He had an easy charm, the kind of guy who could make anyone feel comfortable, and he was good-looking, dark hair, athletic build, a smile that was just a little too confident. At first, it was nothing. Just casual conversations over the fence when we were both outside, or a quick hello in passing when I saw him at the grocery store. He'd always ask how things were going, how the kids were, how Peter was doing. He had a way of making me feel like he was really listening, like he cared. But over time, those little moments became something I looked forward to. I found myself lingering outside longer when I knew Alex was around, hoping for a chance to talk to him. It was innocent, I told myself, just friendly conversation with a neighbor. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. One afternoon, when Peter was out of town for work and the kids were at school, I was out in the front yard pulling weeds when Alex came over. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, the kind of casual outfit that shouldn't have caught my attention but did. "Hey, Emma," he said, flashing that easy smile. "Need some help?" I wiped the dirt from my hands and stood up, feeling a little self-conscious. "Oh, no, I'm just about done. But thanks." He leaned against the fence, his eyes scanning the yard. "You've got a nice setup here. Linda and I are still figuring out how to keep our plants alive." I laughed. "It's mostly luck, I think. Half the time I don't know what I'm doing." Alex chuckled, his eyes lingering on mine for just a second too long. There was something in that look, something unspoken but undeniable. My heart raced in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. We talked for a few more minutes, about nothing in particular, but the entire time I felt the tension between us building. It was subtle, just beneath the surface, but it was there. And when he finally said goodbye and headed back to his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That night, as I lay in bed beside Peter, who was already fast asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. It wasn't that I wanted to act on anything. I told myself that over and over, but I couldn't deny that I felt something when I was around him, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The next few weeks passed in a blur of conflicted emotions. Every time I saw Alex, the attraction between us grew stronger. It was in the way he looked at me, the way he smiled, the casual touches that lingered just a second too long. But we both knew where the line was, and neither of us had crossed it. Not yet. One Friday afternoon, Peter had taken the kids to his parents' house for the weekend. I had stayed behind, telling him I needed a break, some time to relax and catch up on things around the house. I wasn't lying exactly. I did need the break. But part of me just wanted the quiet, to be alone with my thoughts. I was sitting on the back patio with a glass of wine, enjoying the peace and quiet, when I heard a familiar voice from the other side of the fence. "Emma?" I turned to see Alex standing there, a beer in hand. He smiled, his expression casual, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. "Hey, Alex," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's up?" "Not much. Linda's out with some friends, so I'm just hanging out. Mind if I join you?" I hesitated for a moment, but then I nodded. "Sure, why not?" He came around to the patio, settling into the chair next to mine. For a while, we just sat there, sipping our drinks and talking about nothing in particular. But there was a tension in the air, a tension that had been building for weeks. Every time his arm brushed against mine, I felt a spark, and it was getting harder and harder to ignore. "You seem quiet tonight," Alex said after a while, his voice soft. "Everything okay?" I shrugged, swirling the wine in my glass. "Yeah, just thinking about things, I guess. Anything you want to talk about?" I glanced over at him, my heart racing. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to really see me, that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just things with Peter aren't what they used to be. We're good, you know? But it's not like it was in the beginning." Alex nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I get it. Marriage is hard. People change, and sometimes it's hard to keep up with each other." "Yeah," I said, my throat tight. "I guess that's it." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words, unspoken desires. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out and placed my hand on his arm. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like crossing a line. Alex looked down at my hand, then back up at me, his expression serious. "Emma," he said softly, his voice low, "what are we doing?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know." He didn't move, didn't pull away, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was thinking the same thing I was, that this was dangerous, that we were playing with fire. But neither of us stopped. Before I knew what was happening, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was brief, almost fleeting, but it sent a shockwave through me. When he pulled back, we both stared at each other, breathless. "I shouldn't have done that," Alex said, his voice thick with regret, but I didn't regret it. Not for a second. "I wanted you to," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. And just like that, the floodgates opened. We kissed again, this time with more urgency, more need. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as I tangled my fingers in his hair. Every kiss, every touch felt electric, like we were both drowning in a wave of desire we could no longer control. We both knew it was wrong. We both knew that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I could think about was the way Alex made me feel. Alive, wanted, desired. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone really saw me. And I wasn't ready to let that go. When it was over, we sat there for a long time, the weight of what we had just done pressing down on us like a physical force. The reality of it all hit me like a tidal wave, and the guilt began to settle in. What had I done? Alex was silent, his face a mixture of regret and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Finally, he stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I should go," he said, his voice strained. "This was a mistake." I nodded, unable to find my voice. He walked away without another word, leaving me alone on the patio, the remnants of the night swirling around me. As soon as he was gone, the guilt crashed over me in full force. I felt sick, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I had crossed a line I had never intended to cross, and there was no going back now. But even as the guilt consumed me, there was something else there too. Something darker, something more dangerous. I didn't regret it. I didn't regret the way Alex had made me feel, the way his touch had ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't regret the connection we had shared, the escape from the monotony of my life with Peter. But now, I had to face the consequences of my actions. I had to figure out what this meant for me, for my marriage, for everything. And I wasn't sure I was ready to do that. In the days that followed, I avoided Alex. I didn't know what to say, how to act around him now that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Every time I saw him in the yard or walking to his car, I felt a rush of guilt mixed with something else, something that felt a lot like desire. Peter didn't notice anything was different. He was so caught up in work and the kids that he barely registered that I was more distant than usual. I was grateful for that, but it also made me feel worse. How had we gotten to this point, where we could live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, and still feel like strangers? One afternoon, about a week after that night on the patio, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when there was a knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing, knowing it could only be one person. I opened the door to find Alex standing there, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression serious. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, but then stepped aside, letting him in. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, the tension between us palpable. "I'm sorry," Alex said finally, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean for things to go that far." "I didn't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it did." He nodded, his eyes scanning the room as if he couldn't quite bring himself to look at me. "What do we do now?" That was the question, wasn't it? What do we do now? We had crossed a line, but the pull between us was still there, stronger than ever. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know how to stop." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Neither do I." And just like that, we were back where we had started. The tension, the desire, the undeniable connection between us. It was all still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for one of us to make the first move. Before I could think better of it, I stepped closer to him, my heart pounding in my chest. Alex's eyes darkened, his breath hitching as I reached for his hand. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered, even as his fingers intertwined with mine. "I know," I whispered back, but I didn't let go. Neither did he. That afternoon, we gave into the pull again. It wasn't just about lust or desire. There was something deeper there, something that neither of us could explain. It was like we were filling a void that had been growing inside us for years, a void that neither of our marriages had been able to fill. But when it was over, the guilt came crashing down on me again, heavier this time. What had started as a moment of weakness had now turned into something more, something I couldn't easily walk away from. Alex left soon after, but we both knew this wasn't the end. We were in too deep now, and I wasn't sure either of us had the strength to pull ourselves out. That night, as I lay in bed beside Peter, I couldn't stop thinking about Alex, about the way his touch had made me feel, about the guilt that gnawed at me, and about the terrifying realization that I didn't know how to stop. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. But the question was, how far was I willing to go? The affair with Alex continued in secret. We were careful, meeting only when we knew our spouses wouldn't be around, keeping our conversations casual and light when anyone else was present. But every stolen glance, every whispered word, only fueled the fire between us. It was intoxicating, dangerous, and completely unsustainable. The guilt was always there, lurking in the background, but the thrill of being with Alex overshadowed it. I told myself it wasn't love, that I was still committed to Peter, still loved him, but the lines had become so blurred, I wasn't sure what was true anymore. One day, while Peter was away on yet another business trip, Alex and I met at a park on the other side of town, far enough away that no one would recognize us. We sat on a bench, talking about nothing in particular, but the tension between us was as strong as ever. "Do you ever think about what we're doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "About how wrong it is?" Alex didn't answer right away. He stared at the ground, his jaw clenched. "Every day," he said finally, "but I can't stop." Neither could I. We both knew we were on borrowed time. Affairs like ours never stayed hidden forever. Someone would find out, and when they did, the fallout would be catastrophic. We were both playing with fire, and eventually, We were going to get burned. But even knowing that, I couldn't bring myself to end it. I wasn't ready to give up the way Alex made me feel, the excitement, the passion, the escape from the monotony of my life. And so we continued, dancing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one misstep would send us both tumbling into the abyss. The affair went on for months, each secret meeting feeling more dangerous than the last. Every time we were together, the guilt gnawed at me, but it was never enough to make me stop. I was addicted to the way Alex made me feel, to the escape he offered from the routine of my life with Peter. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last forever. And then, one evening, everything came crashing down. It was a Friday, and Peter had taken the kids to a friend's house for a sleepover. I had planned to spend the night catching up on work, but instead, I found myself texting Alex, asking if he could come over. He arrived not long after, and we spent the evening together, tangled up in each other, pretending for a few brief hours that the rest of the world didn't exist. But as the night wore on, the guilt became too much to bear. I could feel it weighing on me, heavier than it had ever been before. After Alex left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty wine glass on the coffee table, my heart pounding in my chest. What was I doing? How had I let things get this far? And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Peter. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. Those 4 words sent a wave of panic crashing over me. He knew. Somehow, he knew. Peter came home the next morning, his face pale, his expression unreadable. The kids ran inside, laughing and shouting, oblivious to the tension between us. I stood in the kitchen, my heart racing as Peter walked toward me. "We need to talk," he said again, his voice calm but cold. I nodded, my hands shaking. "Okay." We went into the living room, closing the door behind us. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Finally, Peter spoke. "Are you cheating on me?" His voice was steady, but I could see the pain in his eyes, the betrayal lurking just beneath the surface. I couldn't lie. Not anymore. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I am." The words hung in the air between us, and I saw the devastation wash over his face. He turned away, his hands clenched into fists, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "How long?" he asked, his voice strained. "A few months," I admitted, my throat tight. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally turned back to me, his eyes were filled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. "Why?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Why? Why had I done this to him, to our family? I didn't have a good answer. I didn't know why. "I don't know," I said, tears welling in my eyes. I wasn't happy. We weren't connecting anymore. And then Alex. Peter's voice rose, his face twisting in anger. "Alex, our neighbor? You've been sleeping with him?" I nodded, unable to look him in the eye. "Yes." Peter let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick with tension. I could feel the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me, suffocating me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the tears spilling over. "I'm so sorry." But my apologies meant nothing. They couldn't undo what I had done. They couldn't erase the betrayal, the hurt, the damage I had caused. Peter didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, alone with the wreckage of our marriage. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Peter moved into the guest room, and we barely spoke. The tension in the house was unbearable, but we tried to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. They didn't know what was going on, and we both agreed to keep it that way, at least for now. But the silence between Peter and me was deafening. I wanted to fix things, to somehow undo the damage I had caused, but I didn't know where to start. Every time I looked at him, I saw the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal that I had caused, and it broke me. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Peter finally sat down with me in the living room. His face was tired, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emma." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, but I knew he was right. I had done the unforgivable. I had broken his trust, destroyed the foundation of our marriage, and I didn't know if it could be repaired. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Peter nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I believe you, but sorry doesn't fix this." "I know," I said, my chest tight, "but I want to try. I want to fix this. I want us." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know if that's possible." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Finally, Peter stood up. "I need time. I need to figure out if I can move past this. If we can move past this." I nodded, my heart sinking. "Take all the time you need." As he walked away, I realized that I had no control over what happened next. Whether our marriage survived or not was up to Peter now. All I could do was wait and hope that somehow he could find it in his heart to forgive me. But even if he did, I knew that things would never be the same again. The trust we had once shared was shattered, and no matter how hard I tried to piece it back together, the cracks would always be there. Weeks passed, and Peter remained distant. He didn't move out, but he might as well have. We existed in the same house, but we were living separate lives. He barely looked at me, barely spoke to me, and I couldn't blame him. I had broken something that couldn't easily be repaired. In the quiet moments, when the kids were at school and the house was empty, I thought about Alex. He and Linda had sold their house and moved away not long after the affair came to light. I hadn't seen him since, and part of me was relieved. I couldn't bear the thought of facing him, of seeing the reminder of everything I had done. But as much as I wanted to blame Alex, I knew this was on me. I had made the choices that had led us here. I had allowed the affair to happen, and now I had to live with the consequences. One afternoon, Peter came home from work early. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when he walked in. I turned to look at him, my heart racing. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded, wiping my hands on a towel. "Of course." We sat down at the kitchen table, the tension between us thick and heavy. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for him to speak. "I've been thinking a lot," Peter began, his eyes fixed on the table. "About us. About everything that's happened." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Okay." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you for what you did, Emma, but I love you, and I think, maybe, we can work through this, if we both want to." The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. I had been prepared for him to say he wanted a divorce, that he was done with me, with us. But instead, he was offering a lifeline, a chance to rebuild what I had broken. "I want to," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I want to fix this. I want us to be okay again." Peter nodded, though the pain was still evident in his eyes. "It's going to take time, a lot of time, and things will never be the same. But if you're willing to work for it, so am I." Tears filled my eyes, and I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. "I'll do whatever it takes. I promise." Peter squeezed my hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew there were no guarantees. But the fact that Peter was willing to try meant everything to me. As we sat there in the quiet kitchen, holding hands across the table, I realized that this was the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But it was a journey I was willing to take, because I loved Peter, and I was determined to make things right. The weeks that followed were slow, cautious, and filled with difficult conversations. Peter and I went to couples counseling, something neither of us had ever thought we'd need. Our therapist helped us unpack the layers of resentment, hurt, and betrayal that had built up between us over the years. It wasn't just the affair that had fractured our relationship, it was everything that had led up to it. We talked about the emotional distance that had grown between us, the lack of communication, the way we had both taken each other for granted. It was painful to confront those truths, to see the ways in which we had failed each other long before the affair even began. But slowly, over time, we began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us under. There were still moments when I could see the doubt in Peter's eyes, the unspoken question of whether he had made the right choice in staying. But we kept going. We kept showing up for each other, even when it was hard. We made time for each other, made an effort to connect in ways we hadn't before. We went on dates, we talked more openly, and we found small moments of joy in the everyday. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. The affair was a wound that would always be there, a scar that would never fully heal. But we were learning how to live with it, how to move forward in spite of it. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, Peter turned to me, his expression soft. "I think we're going to be okay," he said quietly. I smiled, my heart full of hope. "Yeah, I think we are." And in that moment, I knew that while we could never go back to the way things were, we could move forward. We could create something new, something stronger, something worth fighting for. Because in the end, that's what love is. It's not about perfection or never making mistakes. It's about choosing each other, even when things get hard. It's about staying, even when it would be easier to walk away. And for that, I was grateful. Even after Peter said we were going to be okay, there was still a heaviness that hung in the air between us. We had agreed to try and move forward, but there was no manual for how to rebuild a marriage after something like this. No amount of therapy or heartfelt conversations could take away the pain I had caused him, and there was no way to erase the guilt that had burrowed deep inside of me. In the weeks that followed, we tiptoed around each other, careful not to say or do anything that might trigger old wounds. We were both trying. God, were we trying? But there was still a part of me that feared it might not be enough. That no matter how many promises I made, no matter how many times I apologized, there would always be a part of Peter that couldn't fully trust me again. One evening, while the kids were out with friends, Peter and I sat in the living room, a soft rain tapping against the windows. He had been distant all day, quieter than usual, and I could feel the tension building between us. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice gentle, though I already knew the answer. He sighed, leaning back in his chair and rubbing a hand across his face. "I don't know, Emma. Some days, I think we're making progress. And then other days, I can't stop thinking about it. About him. About you and him." My chest tightened, the familiar guilt rising in my throat. I wished I could take his pain away, wished there was something I could say that would make it all disappear. But there wasn't. "I know it's hard," I whispered. "I wish I could take it all back, Peter. I wish I could undo everything I've done to hurt you." He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the window. "I don't understand how you could do it. I keep trying to figure it out, to make sense of it, but I can't. You say you were unhappy, that we were disconnected, but why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you needed more from me instead of turning to him?" His words cut deep, and I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. He was right. Why hadn't I just talked to him? Why had I allowed myself to fall into something so destructive instead of trying to fix what was broken between us? "I don't have a good answer," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I should have come to you. I should have told you how I was feeling, but I didn't. And I'm so sorry for that. I know I can't change what I did, but I'm here now. I'm trying to fix things, Peter. I'm trying to be better." He nodded slowly, his jaw clenched as he processed my words. "I know you are. I can see that. But it's hard." "I know," I whispered, reaching for his hand. He hesitated for a moment before taking it, his grip loose but present. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. "I don't expect you to just forgive me and move on," I continued. "I know this is going to take time, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm committed to us, to our family. I want to rebuild what we had, but I need you to believe that I'm in this for the long haul." Peter finally looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for something, truth, maybe, or reassurance. "I do believe you," he said quietly, "but it's going to take a long time before I can fully trust you again." "I understand," I said, squeezing his hand, "and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." We sat there in silence for a while, holding hands as the rain continued to fall outside. It wasn't a perfect moment, and it didn't erase the hurt or the damage we had caused each other. But it was a step, a small, fragile step towards something that resembled healing. Over the next several months, Peter and I continued the slow, delicate process of rebuilding our marriage. We were more open with each other, more willing to talk about our feelings, our fears, our frustrations. There were still moments of tension, moments when the past threatened to drag us down, but we had learned how to navigate those difficult conversations without letting them consume us. Peter still had days when the anger and hurt bubbled to the surface. I could always tell when those days were coming. He'd grow quiet, his face tense, and I knew he was thinking about the affair, about Alex. I'd learned to give him space when he needed it, but I also made sure to be there for him, to remind him that I wasn't running away from the pain I had caused. We continued seeing our therapist, Rachel, who had become a crucial part of our healing process. She pushed us to go deeper, to confront not just the affair itself, but the underlying issues that had led us there. "Trust is like a fragile thread," Rachel said during one session. "It's something you both have to work at every day. You can't take it for granted, and you can't expect it to just reappear overnight. But if you keep showing up for each other, if you keep choosing each other, that thread will start to strengthen." I nodded, grateful for her wisdom, but also terrified of the long road ahead. I knew Peter and I were making progress, but there were still moments when I doubted whether we would ever fully recover. One evening, Peter came home from work and surprised me with tickets to a concert, a band we used to listen to when we were younger, back when our relationship was still new and full of excitement. I hadn't even realized they were coming to town, and the gesture caught me off guard. "I thought it might be fun," he said, his voice uncertain. "You know, something to take our minds off everything." I smiled, touched by his effort. I'd love that. That night, as we stood in the crowded concert hall, surrounded by music and memories, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Peter held my hand the entire time, and for a few hours, it was like we were back in the beginning, before everything had gotten so complicated. After the concert, we grabbed drinks at a nearby bar, laughing and talking like we hadn't in years. It felt good, normal, even. And as we sat there, sipping our drinks and reminiscing about our early days together, I realized something important. We were still capable of joy. Even after everything that had happened, we could still find happiness in each other. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't magically fix everything, but it was a reminder that we were more than just our mistakes. We were more than just the pain and the betrayal. We were two people who had shared a life, who had built something together, and who were willing to fight for it. That night, when we got home, Peter pulled me into his arms and kissed me like he hadn't in months. It was a slow, tender kiss, filled with a mixture of longing and hope. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly on the same page, like we were moving forward together. As we lay in bed that night, wrapped up in each other, I whispered, "I love you." Peter held me close, his voice soft in the darkness. "I love you too, Emma. We're going to be okay." As the months passed, Peter and I continued to work on our marriage, and gradually, the cracks that had once felt so deep began to heal. It wasn't a straight line. There were still setbacks, still days when the weight of the past threatened to pull us under, but we were stronger now, We had learned how to communicate, how to be honest with each other, and most importantly, how to choose each other every day. One morning, as we sat together at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching the kids play outside, Peter turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice careful, "about us, about everything we've been through." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I don't want to keep dwelling on the past," he said, his eyes soft. "I know we still have work to do, but I feel like we've turned a corner. I feel like we're starting to build something new." His words filled me with a sense of relief, and I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I feel the same way." Peter smiled, a small, tentative smile, but there was a lightness to it that hadn't been there in a long time. "I think we're going to be okay, Emma. I really do." It was the same thing he had said months ago, but this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like a promise. We had been through the worst, and we had come out the other side. We were still standing, still fighting for each other, and in the end, that was what mattered. As we sat there together, watching the world outside our window, I realized that our marriage wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about never making mistakes or never hurting each other. It was about learning how to heal, how to forgive, and how to keep choosing love, even when it was hard. And as I looked at Peter, I knew that we were ready to move forward, not as the people we had been before the affair, but as the people we had become because of it. Stronger, wiser, and more committed to each other than ever before. We weren't perfect, but we were real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that healing wasn't just about Peter forgiving me, or about rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. It was also about forgiving myself. Every time I looked at him, the guilt resurfaced. Even though Peter had told me he loved me, that we were going to be okay, I couldn't shake the shame of what I had done. I didn't know if I deserved this second chance, and that doubt haunted me. But Peter had changed. He no longer looked at me with suspicion, no longer avoided talking about the affair. He had made a decision to stay, and he was sticking to it. He hadn't forgotten what I'd done. Neither of us could, but he was moving forward. And somehow, I had to learn to do the same. One Saturday morning, Peter suggested we take the kids on a weekend getaway. It was something we hadn't done in a long time, and I could see in his eyes that he wanted to create new memories, something to replace the pain we had been living with. "We'll head to that lake we used to visit before the kids were born," he said, his voice carrying a note of excitement. "I think it'll be good for us. A change of scenery." I hesitated. The idea of spending the entire weekend together, away from the comfort and familiarity of home, made me anxious. What if the cracks started to show again? What if the distance between us that we had been working so hard to close suddenly felt insurmountable? But Peter's smile, his optimism, won me over. "Yeah," I agreed softly. "That sounds like a great idea." The drive to the lake was peaceful, the kids laughing in the back seat as we played old road trip games. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were a family again, not two people trying to hold everything together. Peter and I exchanged glances, and in his eyes, I saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe this weekend could be the fresh start we needed. The lake house was just as I remembered it, rustic, quiet, tucked away in the woods. We had spent our early years of marriage there, back when everything between us was easy. It felt like stepping into the past, but with the weight of the present pressing down on us. After unpacking, we took the kids down to the lake. They were thrilled, jumping into the water with abandon while Peter and I sat on the shore, watching them play. It was a beautiful day, the sun reflecting off the lake, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension still simmering. "This place brings back a lot of memories," Peter said quietly, his gaze fixed on the water. I nodded, my throat tight. "It does." For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The memories of our time at the lake, before the affair, before the distance, were bittersweet now. But I realized something as I watched our kids splash and laugh. We were still here. Despite everything, we had made it to this point. And that meant something. I want to make new memories, Peter said suddenly, turning to face me. I don't want us to keep living in the shadow of what happened. I want to build something better. For us. For the kids. I felt the sting of tears, but this time they weren't out of guilt or shame. They were tears of relief. Peter wasn't giving up, and neither was I. I do too, I whispered, my voice shaky. I want that more than anything. Peter reached over, taking my hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a bridge between us, a reminder that we were in this together. We sat there like that for a while, watching the kids and holding hands, letting the warmth of the sun and the sound of the water wash over us. That night, after the kids were in bed, Peter and I sat outside on the porch. The sky was clear, the stars reflecting on the surface of the lake. There was a peacefulness in the air, a calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. I've been thinking a lot, Peter said, his voice soft in the quiet of the night. About us. About the future. I looked at him, my heart racing slightly. And I don't want to live in the past anymore. I don't want to keep reopening old wounds. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. I don't know if I'll ever fully forget what happened, Emma, but I don't want it to define us. I want to move forward. I want to keep building something new. His words filled me with a mixture of relief and fear. Moving forward meant facing the future together, but it also meant that I had to finally let go of the guilt that had been weighing me down. It meant believing that I deserved his forgiveness, and that was the hardest part. I don't want it to define us either, I said quietly, but sometimes, I don't know how to move past it. I still feel like I don't deserve this second chance. Peter was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a tenderness that took me by surprise. You made a mistake, Emma, a terrible one, but you've been trying every day to make things right. That counts for something, and you don't have to carry the weight of what happened alone. We're both carrying it. I felt the tears spill over, but this time I didn't try to hold them back. Peter reached for my hand, pulling me closer to him. We'll figure this out. Together. That night, lying in his arms, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but it felt lighter somehow. Peter had given me something I hadn't been able to give myself, permission to forgive. Not just him, but me. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Returning home from the lake was like stepping into a new chapter of our lives. We weren't perfect, but there was a sense of peace between us now, an understanding that we were moving forward together. The affair still lingered in the background, but it no longer dominated our every conversation, our every thought. We had started to heal. I made a conscious effort to be more present, not just for Peter but for myself. I had spent so long punishing myself for what I had done, for betraying the man I loved, that I had forgotten how to live in the moment. But now, with Peter's forgiveness and the hard work we had both put in, I realized that there was a future for us, one that didn't have to be defined by my mistakes. We still went to therapy, though our sessions became less frequent as we found our footing again. Rachel, our therapist, was a constant source of support, helping us navigate the ups and downs of rebuilding our relationship. Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing, Rachel reminded us during one session. It's something you both will have to keep practicing. There will be good days and bad days, but as long as you keep choosing each other, you'll keep moving forward. Peter and I had learned to communicate in a way we hadn't before. We were honest with each other, even when it was hard. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past threatened to creep back in, but we faced those moments head-on, together. One night, as we lay in bed, Peter turned to me, his voice soft in the darkness. Do you ever regret staying? The question took me by surprise, and I hesitated before answering. No, I said finally. I regret what I did, but I don't regret that we're here, trying to make this work. Do you? Peter was quiet for a moment before shaking his head. No, I don't regret it either. I smiled, reaching for his hand. We're going to be okay, Peter. He squeezed my hand, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Yeah, I think we are. As we lay there together, the weight of everything we had been through finally felt manageable. It was still there, but it wasn't crushing us anymore. We had learned how to carry it together. Part 16. A Life Reclaimed. Months passed, and life slowly returned to something that resembled normal. We weren't the same people we had been before the affair, and our marriage wasn't the same either. But in some ways, that was a good thing. We had grown stronger, more resilient, more connected. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past would rear its ugly head and remind us of what we had been through. But those moments were fewer and farther between now, and each time, we faced them together. Peter had forgiven me, but more importantly, I had finally forgiven myself. It hadn't been easy, and there were still days when the guilt would resurface, but I had learned how to manage it, how to remind myself that I was worthy of this second chance. We had rebuilt our marriage from the ground up, and while it wasn't perfect, it was real. It was honest. And that was what mattered. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Peter turned to me with a soft smile. "We've come a long way," he said quietly. I nodded, feeling a warmth in my chest. "We have." Peter reached for my hand, and as our fingers intertwined, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had made it through the storm, and while the road had been long and difficult, we had come out stronger on the other side. "I love you," Peter said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I love you too," I whispered, my heart full, and in that moment, I knew that we were finally okay. We had reclaimed our life, our love, and our future, and that was all that mattered. Life had slowly returned to a sense of normalcy between Peter and me. We had weathered the storm of my affair with Alex, rebuilt our marriage, and I was starting to believe that maybe we could leave the past behind for good. But life has a way of testing you just when you think you've found solid ground. It started innocently enough, just like it had with Alex. A new family moved into the house across the street. They were a little younger than us, with no kids yet, but friendly enough. Their names were Daniel and Jessica. I didn't pay much attention at first. We'd already been through the process of welcoming new neighbors before, and I had learned the hard way how dangerous even the most casual of interactions could become. Peter and I went over to say hello when they were moving in, bringing a casserole and some wine, just like we had with Alex and Linda. Jessica was warm and bubbly, instantly inviting us inside, while Daniel lingered back, shy but polite. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair and an easy smile that reminded me of Alex, though I quickly pushed the thought out of my mind. I wasn't going to repeat my mistakes. Peter hit it off with Jessica right away, talking about sports and local events, while Daniel and I exchanged the usual pleasantries. Nothing about our interaction felt particularly significant, but there was a moment when our eyes met and I felt something. A flicker of recognition, a tension I wasn't ready to admit existed. I ignored it, or at least, I tried to. A few weeks passed, and Peter and I settled back into our routine. The kids were busy with school, and we were making more of an effort to spend time together. We'd go on evening walks, make plans for the weekend, and sometimes sit in the backyard late at night, just talking. It was good. It felt right. But there was something nagging at me, something I couldn't quite shake. Daniel. I saw him often enough, working in his yard or coming home from work, and every time I did, I felt a strange pull toward him. I told myself it was nothing. After all, I had already learned what happened when I let myself get too close to a neighbor. I wasn't going to go down that road again. But sometimes, it's the very thing you're trying to avoid that comes right to your doorstep. One Saturday, Peter and I were hosting a small barbecue for some friends and neighbors. The weather was perfect, clear skies, warm air, the kind of day that made you forget about the problems in life for a while. Jessica and Daniel came over, along with a few other couples from the neighborhood. Everything was relaxed, Easy. Peter was in charge of the grill, laughing with his friends, while I made small talk with Jessica. At one point during the afternoon, I went inside to grab more drinks from the fridge. When I turned around, Daniel was standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on me. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice casual. I shook my head, feeling a little flustered by his sudden presence. "No, I'm good. Just grabbing some drinks." But he didn't leave. He stood there, watching me as I loaded the tray, and the air between us seemed to shift, just like it had that first day we met. "You and Peter seem really happy," Daniel said after a moment, his tone sincere but with something else underneath it. "You guys have a great thing." I smiled, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. "Yeah, we've been through a lot, but we're stronger for it." There was a pause, and I could feel his eyes on me, heavy with something unspoken. "It's nice to see a couple who can get through tough times," he said quietly. "Not everyone can do that." I stopped what I was doing and looked up at him. There was something in his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or an understanding that went deeper than the surface-level conversations we'd had up until now. It was like he knew that Peter and I had been through something, like he could sense the cracks in our foundation, even if we were trying to rebuild. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the feeling. "It hasn't been easy, but we're in a good place now." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me a little too long, and I felt the same pull that had led me down the wrong path before. I needed to get out of the kitchen, back to the safety of the backyard where Peter was, where everything was normal. But as I turned to leave, Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, if you ever need to talk, I'm around." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I wasn't sure if it was from the offer itself or the implication behind it. He was offering more than just a listening ear, and we both knew it. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I hurried past him, back outside, forcing a smile as I handed out the drinks, trying to shake the strange sensation of Daniel's presence. But for the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. Part 18. Temptation Revisited. After that barbecue, Daniel became a constant presence in my thoughts. It was like a replay of what had happened with Alex, only this time I was more aware of the danger. Every time I saw him, I was reminded of the line I had crossed before and how easy it would be to cross it again. But I told myself I was stronger now. I had learned my lesson. I had almost lost everything, and I wasn't about to throw away the progress Peter and I had made for a second time. Still, Daniel seemed to be everywhere. Whether it was a casual wave as he drove by or bumping into him at the grocery store, he always managed to find a way into my day. And each time, there was a look in his eyes that unsettled me, a mixture of curiosity and something darker. One evening, as Peter and I sat on the back porch, I noticed Daniel sitting alone in his own backyard, a beer in hand. His wife, Jessica, was out of town for work, and the sight of him sitting there by himself made something stir inside me. Pity, maybe, or something more dangerous. I tried not to look in his direction, but my eyes kept drifting back to him, drawn by an invisible force. Peter must have noticed because he reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just lost in thought." Peter smiled back, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He trusted me again, but I knew that trust was fragile. He had forgiven me for what had happened with Alex, but that forgiveness was something I had to earn every day. "I'm going to head inside," Peter said after a while, standing up and stretching. "You coming?" "In a minute," I replied, watching him disappear through the sliding door. As soon as he was gone, I glanced back at Daniel's yard. He was still there, and this time, his eyes were on me. There was a moment of hesitation, of uncertainty, and then, before I could stop myself, I stood up and walked to the fence that separated our yards. "What are you doing out here all alone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Daniel smiled, his eyes lighting up as if he had been waiting for me to come over. Just enjoying the quiet. I nodded, leaning against the fence. It's nice out tonight. He took a sip of his beer, his gaze never leaving mine. It is. Mind if I ask you something? I hesitated, my heart starting to race. Sure. Daniel set down his beer, his expression serious. What's the story between you and Peter? I mean, I know every couple has their issues, but there's something, I don't know, something different about you two. His question caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. How much did he know? Had someone in the neighborhood mentioned the affair, or was he just picking up on the tension that still lingered between Peter and me? It's complicated, I said carefully, but we've been working through it. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. I get that. Jessica and we're not exactly in the best place either. I wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but there was something dangerous in the way he was looking at me, something that felt too familiar. Marriage is hard, I said, trying to keep the conversation light. But it's worth fighting for. Daniel's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer to the fence, his voice lowering to a whisper. Is it? Or are there times when you wonder if it's worth it at all? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was too close to the thoughts I had struggled with during my affair with Alex, the same doubts that had led me down a path I couldn't turn back from. I began, but the words caught in my throat. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze intense. I see the way you look at me, Emma. Don't pretend you don't feel it too. Panic surged through me. This was dangerous territory, and I knew it. But there was also a part of me that couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the same pull that had nearly destroyed my life before.